Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. My guest this week is Rick Hanson. Rick is a psychologist and senior fellow at UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center. He's the best-selling author of several books, including Buddha's Brain, Hardwiring Happiness and Neurodharma. Today, we discuss meditation and its relationship to the brain. Hope you enjoy the conversation.
Okay, I'm here with Rick Hanson. Rick, thanks for being on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, James. And I want to just kind of say from the outset that I think of myself as scientific in my aspirations, but not as a scientist per se. I consume, produce very little. I have great respect for people who do. I'm a methods guy. I'm an applications person in the trenches. So with that, hopefully humble disclaimer, sincerely humble disclaimer, we can get going. So just kind of know that going in. I'm very interested in your work and what you do.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we can turn this into a dialogue and explore. I'm sure there's a lot of areas of overlap of interest. But I'd be interested to begin with a bit about your kind of early starting point and becoming interested in working with the mind.
Oh, okay. Well, probably like a lot of people. Well, actually, the deeply honest answer is going back to when I was a young child, 2 or 3. In the background of my experience was this sort of poignant, wistful feeling that there was a lot of unnecessary unhappiness. And I grew up in a fairly stable, middle-class, suburban American background in an intact family with loving, decent parents. And still, I just felt there was so much more hassling and nervousness and bickering and struggle and tension than there really needed to be. And I want to honor that, knowing that's present in so many people when they go back to their own childhood. What are the things you knew as a kid? So already I had a vision of what was possible. There was a well-being, an ordinary human well-being that was also second not happening. And that kind of set me on my way. And then beginning in, I would say, high school, adolescence, I had this kind of realization, while being very neurotic and unhappy, that it was always possible to learn a little and grow a little every day. That immediately got me interested in the mind. How do you become a little more skillful with other people? How do you not be so nervous around girls, in my case? How do you not be so invaded by your parents? How do you not feel so hopeless? How do you work with your own mind? I didn't know how to do it, but that definitely set me on my way. Then I landed in college in 1969. I was 16 when I started at UCLA. I was young. And it was the beginning of the whole human potential movement. It was cultural ferment. That was really great. Toward the end of that opened the doors into contemplative practice and the contemplative traditions of the world. Mainly the ones that I was more interested in were from the East, like Buddhism, which is very empirical and scientific in its way, empirical and pragmatic. And then to finish, all along, even back in the 1970s, it was clear to me that the underlying basis within the natural frame of our mental processes are neurobiological processes embedded in larger networks of life altogether, in nature altogether. We didn't know much about what was actually happening under the hood in the 3 pounds of tofu-like tissue inside the coconut, as I say. But that was absolutely central. And so I always had a feeling for the neuroscience part. I became a clinician because I had the heart to work with people. I really wanted to do that. And then beginning, I would say around 20, 30 years ago, I think there was almost a critical mass of implementable, practical information coming from neuroscience that could be used by therapists and contemplative teachers and practitioners, and I'm both. So at that point then, to finish, it really ignited the intersection of these 3 domains, right? Psychology, contemplative wisdom, hardcore brain science. And where those circles intersect, I just think is the super sweet spot, full of great ideas and skillful means to help others and help ourselves.
Right. And I love when you said at the beginning, you said about having a kind of relatively comfortable upbringing and then saying, and still, there was things to be worked through, sufferings of a kind. And that, just that phrase, and still really made me think that really fits well with Buddhism and the Buddha's story of being incredibly, coming from a position of abundance, and then discovering that there's this, that suffering exists still, right? There's still something, things aren't just perfect if you get everything you want. So yeah, I think that's, I can see why maybe you found your way to Buddhist contemplative practices with that particular way you phrased it.
I've never thought of that comparison, and I would dare never compare myself to the Buddha, right? But there is some
I'll do it for
analog there.
you.
Oh, okay. There is an analog there, isn't there?
Yeah.
And I think it's helpful for people to go back to things that you knew in your innermost being when you were young. You probably couldn't put them into words very well, or they weren't very conceptual, but there are things you really knew that are touchstones for you, and you can draw on them today.
Yeah. And then on the science side of things, to play devil's advocate, you're not going to need to convince me that the science is valuable. But given that for millennia, contemplatives have been exploring this terrain without knowing the physiology and without using the science, what is it for you in particular that makes the neuroscience a particularly useful tool?
Oh, well, interrupt me if I blather on too much. I'll try to cut to the chase. We can know ourselves in two ways. Until recently, the only way we could know ourselves was from the inside out, subjectively, from the first person perspective. That's the perspective the Buddha used. Just a detail, I'm late to this kind of material, but I'm beginning to read the essays of Montaigne, which are beautiful. And he's has such a sense of his own psychology and the minds of others, and so he's writing about that, right? So we can know ourselves in that way. That's how Freud, although Freud, as you know, is a neurologist actually, and his early books were on, the nervous system. But basically, we can know ourselves in that introspective, internal, subjective way. Recently, in the last 10, 20, 30 years, increasingly, we can also know ourselves objectively. From the outside in, third-person perspective, what's the underlying neurobiology? And where those two perspectives meet, and as we can toggle back and forth between them, I just think it's full of great potential. Now, of course, we have people like Francisco Varela, right, and Evan Thompson. I want to give full credit there. Notions of neurophenomenology as a research device. And we see people doing that more and more in MRI, fMRI, where they're reporting on their own experience in real time. And even people like Judd Brewer, who are developing programs that can help people have real-time neurofeedback that can help them, for example, become less addicted to something or become less anxious about that. You can just see it's full of opportunity. And I, myself, will toggle. I can give you examples of where it's been really useful to me to bring to bear that third person perspective. Now, from the standpoint of full awakening, enlightenment, from the standpoint of healing and healing trauma, clearly people have been awakened in many traditions or gone very far along. Self-actualization, Maslow's notions and beyond. The upper reaches of human potential do not require the third person perspective. On the other hand, I think that third person perspective that's grounded in the objective nature of the body mind embedded in life is a unifying framework that helps us understand different mind trainings, whether they're from a contemplative tradition, a religious tradition, or entirely secular. There's a common framework because there's just one brain that we're training. Whatever might be the influence of supernatural or transcendental factors, and some would argue that there are none at all. But whatever is other than that, which for many is the whole kit and caboodle, those are natural processes that involve, at bottom, function and structure in the hardware, right? So there's a unifying framework. There's just one brain. No matter what kind of tradition you come from, there's one human brain. Second, it's motivating for many, many people to realize that your practices are actually changing the physical system in lasting ways. So you can harm yourself in lasting ways by marinating in negative ruminations. you can help yourself in lasting ways by resting in wholesome, beneficial qualities of mind and heart, increasingly hardwiring those qualities, metaphorically speaking, into your own nervous system. That's motivating. Third benefit of this third person perspective, bringing it in, bringing the body in, is that it highlights really effective methods that can be also individualized out of the warehouse of 10,000 psychospiritual tools. There's so many tools, but as you understand more about how the brain works, to just put it in that term, and you understand what a person's individual phenotype is, in effect, their own personal expression and temperamentally, then you can highlight which of the 10,000 tools are really useful for this person at this time. That's really helpful. You're not inventing anything new, but you're highlighting it. And then the fourth benefit of naturalizing mental and even contemplative practice, naturalizing, you know the term, I'll say it for people in general, bringing it into a more biological, physical ed-based framework. The fourth benefit is you occasionally start discovering things that are new and why they're new. And you can actually add value. I think neurofeedback is a new technology. Frankly, the research that's being carefully done on psychedelic-assisted therapies and aid, including for contemplative practice, that's interesting. Also, I think there are some things that have struck me that I've never heard of in the 10,000 tools in the psychospiritual warehouse that actually might be a genuine contribution. We could talk about that maybe. But that's the fourth method. So for me, all of those are real benefits. And as a meditator, as a person, as a guy, as a husband, as a dad, as an American, freaked out by the policies sometimes of his, in some of the politics of his country, it helps me to toggle back and forth between, oh, I'm having this experience, something's bothering me, and I'm aware of the ways in which somatic markers are formed in terms of body sensations, or, I have a sense of, the moving back and forth between a kind of default mode network-centered rumination and a more lateral network, sides of the brain, norm-farb kind of stuff, centered mindful presence. I'm kind of aware of what's happening in the hardware. Even though neuroscience is a baby science, we know more than nothing. And being aware of what's happening in the hardware then gives me insight into what I could do with the software to nudge my hardware into a better place. Also, I'm talking at great length. I hope it's okay.
That's great.
I'll shut up. And one last thing, from the standpoint of insight, man, if you care for this sort of thing, when you start to realize that your own precious thoughts, right, your own precious positions, and your own precious sense of self is just the product. It's not an epiphenomenon. I mean, there's a functional purpose in the unfolding of the nervous system, obviously, finally honed in the forge of evolution, 600 million years of evolution of the nervous system. But when you start realizing that your precious stream of consciousness is the product, almost arbitrarily, of several hundred trillion synaptic junctions inside your head, as well as everything else going on in the body, and that it's happening on the basis of an evolutionary frame that's just been shaped intensely in the human DNA. And it's incredibly dynamic. It's very fluid. It's continually being constructed and deconstructed, even at the point of the synapses. I mean, you know better than I, James, but I've read that the average lifespan of a synapse is something on the order of several weeks. It's continually the molecular machinery of all that. When you realize that, you just go, you disidentify from it. You have to lighten up about it. It's not so personal. It's happening ownerlessly. There can't possibly be a central director of the whole show, which goes to relaxing the sense of contracted self, contracted ego. There's a person process unfolding that has rights and responsibilities and should be cared for and matters, and that's all true. While meanwhile, a lot of our notions that there's some kind of fixed self inside, or that our own viewpoints are so precious, may precious, you develop liberating insight just through understanding the gushy, messy, ephemeral neurobiology underneath it all. All right, I'll shut up.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'll add to that a benefit I see, I think, of understanding the science is I think we live at a strange time in human history, and I appreciate, actually, I think we share a similar interest in thinking through kind of on the societal level when we see all the strife that exists at the moment, thinking through on the kind of the vast kind of swathes of human history of what processes have been happening to get us to this point. I'd love to get into that with you. But the relevance here is that I think we live in a time where we've lost a lot of the reliable structures of wisdom that would teach us these things in communities that we could trust. And so there are charlatans and charismatic, teachers who will take you in the wrong direction and who will cause harm. And so I think at this time it's really important for people to empower themselves and learn to figure out what's valid and what's not. And science is laying your cards on the table, right? It's appealing to evidence and kind of skepticism and really seeing what's valid here. So I think taking an interest in the science, while it's not strictly necessary to access these states, I think for people, there can be this sense of like, okay, if a university has produced, if I can see the changes in brains of people who've meditated, I know there's something here. I'm not just being misled by someone charismatic.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, so
that's great. Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely, go for it.
All right. So I'll just take a risk here. Like, what's one thing that you shifted in your own personal mental practices, whether they're formal on the cushion or just in everyday life? You mentioned before we started that you have a wife, you're in a relationship. What's one thing that shifted in how you engage your mind based on what you've learned about your brain?
That's a great question that I don't think I've really explicitly asked myself. It's interesting because I came to these kinds of insights, experiential first-person insights, before becoming interested in the brain, and then the brain just seemed, coming from a secular background, it seemed the way to explore these things further. And when I would describe to people my research, sometimes I would describe it as kind of trying to understand the enemy, almost as seeing these like in this non-dual kind of perspective where the things we want to realize are already fully formed. It's possible to come fully into the now, right now. It's not something you actually need to. It's not a skill you need to build up in your brain. But instead, the brain mediates suffering and mediates. The thing I'm particularly interested in is conceptual boundaries. It chunks things up into self and other and into concepts, and that process, while it's good for survival, if we don't understand it, we don't relax it, we can get lost and in delusion and just be taken away from these modes of liberation. So I was kind of interested in how is this magic trick done that the brain tricks us into thinking we're truly separate, everything's truly kind of made of impermanent, rigid objects. Yeah, and then I really would like to answer your question, but I find that from having that approach, I guess I wasn't looking to the brain to then inform my practice, which is why I really appreciate your work, because you do think this way. You kind of explore the brain and how, as you said earlier, in a kind of methods way, how can we bring this back into our practice? And I think perhaps one thing that has informed my practice is there's some studies looking at the default mode network and the task positive network, which we tend to think of as kind of anti-correlated networks, but that in non-dual practices they become kind of balanced. They become, or at least they're less kind of anti-correlated. So there's a kind of a marriage of inner and outer. And I would say maybe that planted a seed in my mind that when I practice, knowing that that's going on, instead of I would say in the past, maybe I used to, very early on in my practice, I was very focus to the external, away from the body, away from the self, and kind of a self-negating self-transcendence, until I started doing kind of trauma work and learned to come into a more intimate, embodied, non-dual experience. And so I would say learning that stuff about the neuroscience research alongside that practice allowed me to see that the kind of self-transcendence wasn't the place to rest. A kind of a marriage of the kind of being an embodied self who also is connected to a sense of being, a sense of the relative and a sense of the absolute together in conjunction, I guess.
That's deep practice. Isn't it interesting that you, as someone who is deeply engaged with research on the brain, and you actually haven't used in a deliberate way something that you can maybe name here, something you've learned about the brain in your own practice? And I don't mean that obviously as a critique. I mean it in a really friendly way as, well,
Yeah.
that's interesting, isn't it? And A, what an opportunity. And B, I suspect as well, quite common. I've asked this question of other people who have a genuine meditative practice, who are world-class brain researchers. And they don't normally think this way. And I just think it's a missed opportunity. Imagine someone who is a committed athlete and who also is a physician, who has some understanding even of neuromuscular processes, metabolism, the Krebs cycle, what the mitochondria, let's say, are doing. Wouldn't you want to use some of what you know about the hardware of your body to improve your performance in something you care about? Let's say for them, athletics, distinct from contemplative practice, perhaps. And it's a great opportunity there. I mean, I'll answer the question for myself. Maybe one was when I became clear about the negativity bias, which is one of the more robust findings, I think that's practical, that really shifted me. I definitely had a practice that could be with the pain, but on a whole other level, I came to feel that pain is overrated. In that if we fight the pain, then we just add pain to pain. So can't do that. Mindful spaciousness is the way to go. But to dwell there, to ruminate there, to become very identified there, when you realize how biased the brain is towards social, emotional, somatic learning from the negative, where maybe we have a positivity bias for episodic memory. As you know, we tend to we added pain out of our episodic memories, our memories of events, but implicit memory, which is the great bulk, if we define memory and learning as the registration, the storage processes in the nervous system, the great bulk of memory is implicit. It's somatic, it's emotional, it's attitudinal, biases, and so forth. When you realize how much that memory-making process is biased negatively, it really starts to shift how you allocate attention, right? Like that made a difference for me. And I got faster at catching myself when I call it going into the ruminator, the default mode network, going into these little mini movies that were negatively tinged and were not productive. So that was a shift for me.
Right. I think one of the main things probably that does influence my practice is what you speak about a lot, because it's so important, which is the importance of neuroplasticity and the fact that what goes on in your mind will sculpt the brain, right? And so I think, again, coming from a kind of non-dual preference, or my history led me in that direction, the issue with that practice where you see everything as kind of already fully present and you just need to kind of realize it or relax into it, or however you want to say it, there can be a sense of, well, you don't need to meditate, there's nowhere to go, there is no path, just be here now, but then if you realize the kind of, you could say the karmic momentum of your conditioning of your brain, you're not going to inhabit those spaces very often if you're not actively training yourself. So I would say my my knowledge of the brain probably made me hold myself more accountable in terms of having a practice and saying, don't just go around pontificating like, oh yeah, I've realized this, these insights, and now I can just talk about it without meditating. It really kind of points to the wisdom of tracing back the radiance is like a famous Korean Zen phrase for this. You kind of realize these experiences, and then you're trying to integrate them and figure out how to return there and live more wisely on the relative level.
Yeah. If a person can rest in non-dual presence, rested in the ground of all, selflessly with a radiant heart, great. It's hard for people to rest there, to stay there, including when they deal with everyday life. And the people who can rest there stably usually are people who've done a lot of practice over the years. They've changed their brain and their body over the years. And also, there are factors that enable people to stabilize in that way of being. So that involve learning in some ways, social, somatic, spiritual learning. And so I think, if a person can really drop there and stay there, I'm all for it. That's my own practice. My own practice is to help myself rest in being, really, broadly, which for me does have a transpersonal root to it. And to rest there, to rest in remembrance, to rest in contact, right? To allow oneself to be lived by, permeated by, and all the rest of that. Yes, I'm totally signed up for that. I think it's just helpful to appreciate, as you're saying, whether it's about releasing a trauma history or simply mobilizing the kind of factors to be able to rest there in a brain that's not particularly designed through evolution to rest in that kind of state of being. The brain, as you know, we evolved to essentialize and segment, partition. You were talking about that conceptually. This distinct from that, right? The banana distinct from the paw that holds it. And also we have a brain, I've been reflecting, that's incredibly oriented toward the future. It's, as you know, a prediction machine. It's continually oriented around becoming. And there's that difference between being and becoming, and it's so hard to disengage from the partitioning, the segmenting of that which is one, that which is whole, and also to disengage from the machinery of becoming and simply rest in being. Shikantaza, in effect, no gaining mind, just sitting, just being. Really hard to do. So, partly deep practice swims against the currents of evolution and Mother Nature's well-intended plan to keep her monkeys alive. And so that speaks to the importance of making efforts over time that have lasting results, I guess. And do you know the metaphor, by the way, of the two tracks of practice, the two wheels? It's a really, you may have come across it. I'll just say it for people. I learned about it just recently. It comes apparently from roughly early Buddhism, the movement from the Theravada, the early Buddhism into the Mahayana. It's this notion that practice is like a cart with two wheels that follows two tracks. And one of them is the track, as you say, of original nature. Like be one with God already. No worries. Okay? Whatever that might be. Or just be your true self already. Okay. The other track is developmental change over time. It's the releasing of hindrances and afflictions and delusions and greed, hatred, and delusion and sin in different traditions. And it's the cultivation of skills and capabilities and so forth. I myself emphasized that second track for a long time, and it's just been in the last 10 years-ish. I always had an intuition of original nature, I think, from early on, but I didn't particularly practice it because I'm a dogged, grind away kind of person. So of course that first track really, the second track of developmental change really appealed to me. But I've certainly lately come to really appreciate the second track. But they're not at odds with each other. They support each other. And I think people can err on either side. I've known a lot of non-dual people who dogmatically eschew, they critique the second track of developmental change. And while being themselves, frankly, not very functional and not very happy, uh, you know, that's a pitfall. Then there are people like I used to be who get totally trapped up, stuck in self-improvement and aren't really in touch with original nature very much. And, so pitfalls on either side, but two together to me is the sweet spot. Joel, what do you
Yeah.
think about all that?
Yeah, no, that resonates. For me, it was an experience of overwhelming kind of emotional stress at a young age that led to a kind of a non-dual realization moment. And so that happened at such a young age that it was very formative, and everything was then configured around this insight. But then for well over a decade, I lived connecting with this insight. And I mean, it's interesting to have lived it from both sides, because back then I could have said the same things you're kind of pointing to, of like, there's really no need to do anything. Everything's perfect and already as it is and unfolding as it's going to, like, there's nowhere to go, nothing to do. But I always knew that I wasn't seeing the whole picture. There was a reason. Partly I was young, but I also knew, even though I felt I had things to share, but it wasn't time for me to share them, because I could feel there wasn't something that was, because I was suffering. I was still suffering, but then transcending it, and that oscillation didn't feel like a kind of a place to rest. And then through doing the kind of, the dogged psychotherapeutic kind of day after day, week after week, working out things, and it's been a beautiful process. I'm not saying, it's this horrible thing that people have to slog through. But then once I did that, it was a sense of like, okay, like I didn't understand, or I didn't have access to working with the second wheel, and now I do. And now I feel the cart is steady, and I totally recognize the people. It's quite common, I think, the spiritual bypassing thing of recognizing the first, or the insight into true nature wheel, and then being quick to say, great, I'm done, I've crossed the finishing line, don't ask me to do any difficult shadow work or anything. And once it could be quite easy to spot those people if you have done that work. But again, this brings us back to the beginning. For some people, it's not easy to spot, and that's why it's kind of important people to be empowered through these different approaches. Yeah.
Do you have a notion of what's happening in the brain in terms of major features or factors when someone is rested in beingness in a very open way, in which they also feel connected with everything, with a warm heart?
So my thinking is always very much in a kind of system zoomed out way, and I'm very I see a lot of pitfalls with being reductionist. If when we tell nice stories of pinning certain kind of if we say this psychological process is associated with this particular brain area, I think that can often be there are pitfalls to that approach. So I tend to think, if I'm resting in that sense of deep interconnection and presence, I feel like what's the story, the model I would like to put on that as a scientist, is that as an embodied organism, that's a kind of thermodynamic process that truly is continuous with the rest of the universe. And I should say, I see the mind as only existing through embodied organisms in conjunction with the world. I don't think the mind is something that just sits inside the skull. I think it's a lived process. So to me, it's kind of happening at that level, but it's obviously going through the brain. The brain is an important component. So having said that, kind of given that picture of like insight happening in this embodied, zoomed out way, I believe, that there are, again, this is almost why I see the brain as the place where kind of hindrances can come in, where blockages can come in, If there is fear, you could tell a story of amygdala activation based on memory and triggers mediated through, funnel through the hippocampus that then leads to an increased sense of self based on self-protection of your evolved boundaries. But again, my bias is, it's interesting, that I do tend to see it as our physiology. I think my fundamental picture of the world is that as evolved organisms, we come into an attempted separation with the rest of the world. The first amoebas pull apart from the world and try to assert a boundary. They're not truly separate, but they're trying to be separate for a while. And I think it's that process that kind of brings into existence our interior world of subjectivity and of mind. And with that comes suffering. So we're in this process of attempted survival. And then so all our physiology mediates all of these negative or suffering-related processes. But I think it's that struggle is what gives us this gift of being awake, of the universe kind of waking up to itself through coming into a relationship with itself. So I think it's this strange situation we're in, where there is suffering, but there's also because we become awake, there's a possibility to transcend suffering through just being aware of what is. So I think it's a strange bind we're in, but there is a kind of a way out. But it's not a way out of transcendence where, I don't ascribe to views where before life there's the kind of, the blissful mind of God that then comes into all of this suffering, and then when we die, we'll just wake up straight into that enlightened mind of God. To me, that if that's true, I feel a sense of, shouldn't we all just try and go there straight away? Shouldn't we try and run down the clock on this thing and return to our true perfect nature? Like, why? What's the point of this? And you could say it's to learn and discover and grow and these kinds of things. But my intuition is that we find ourselves in this interesting circumstance as organisms. So yeah, these are my biases where it comes to understanding our physiology as necessarily tied up with separation and hindrances, and working with those to become as aligned with the rest of the world. You could say it's kind of like a Taoist picture of if we can flow with natural processes with as little resistance as possible, then we'll discover the true nature of being the world unfolding. And at that point, the brain is just kind of allowing, as any other part of our physiology, is just reacting in a kind of with as little resistance as possible.
I mean, well, thank you for that. Yeah, I certainly can resonate with all that and feel it as you say it. It seems clear to me that absent supernatural or transcendental factors, there's a one-to-one correlation between the flows of information, which are the basis of the flows of experience for a person, and flows of activity in the underlying neural substrate. So we don't know all the details of that, but we, within the natural frame, presume that one-to-one correlation, absent whatever might be supernatural or transcendental. So inside that framework, then, it just seems really clear to me that some things are different in the underlying neurobiology of me when I'm in a good moment and me when I'm in a bad moment, or me when I'm in a pretty good moment much of the time today compared to where I was when I was 15 years old, deeply unhappy and neurotic in high school. So there's a difference. So, okay. And if we care about what people are experiencing, and what they're experiencing, if we care about what we're experiencing, then that would lead kind of naturally to an inquiry into what are the differences in, I'll call it physiology, that underlie differences in psychology that people care about, very straightforwardly. And to that end, I think that it's really useful to reflect on what could be happening in the brain while someone is having a classic self-transcendent non-dual experience that, by survey result, roughly a third of the people in the world at least report having had, including, for example, a flash, even more than, let's say, the flash of insight you had. Right? There's this revelatory in which two things happen typically. The sense of self just drops away fairly quickly, and the sense of the world shines forth in radiant perfection. What's going on there? Maybe it's Kensho or Satori in Zen. Maybe it's Eckhart Tolle just, stepping off the bus, Byron Katie on the floor of her rehab center or something. You know, what is that? And then afterward, for example, what is happening stably in the mind and brain of people who seem truly, truly far along, truly, truly far along? I'm incredibly interested in that question from a personal standpoint and also just intellectual curiosity. I think it's really fascinating. And I think, my book, Neurodharma, starts to actually say, okay, neuroscience is a baby science with a lot of modesty here. How might we operationalize enlightenment neurologically and then reverse engineer that for where any particular person might be in their own path of awakening and then move from there? And there's a lot there that's pretty cool, including what might be happening. And people like James Austin, you probably know, neuroscientist and Zen teacher, have speculated about what is actually happening in the brain during Kensho in Zen. He's a Zen teacher, and I've built that out in my book, Neurodharma, and with some other considerations. But I think we're starting to get some science here about what's happening in the physiology when a person is deeply rested in resilient well-being, with, a utter spaciousness, little sense of self-contraction, and a very loving heart.
Yeah,
That's
I think
hopeful.
it is absolutely, and that's why I really appreciate your work, because I think while my bias is to think about this kind of, again, it's the non-dual thing of saying, rather than saying that when you come up with these kinds of pictures of our genuine interconnection and our genuine presence, I guess that's my bias is to say, people can sometimes think, if we're saying it's going on in the brain, then okay, the brain's generating it. It's almost like a epiphenomenon, some kind of, it's not as real as we might think. But in the work you're doing, yeah, I see it as very much part of the skillful cultivation, as you say, kind of someone who's developed resilience and is resting in these things. We absolutely want to know what's going on in the physiology, and you've done great work in that area. It'd be great to delve into some of that. I wonder if you could share with the audience some of your key kind of points around certain brain networks and what kind of processes are involved in this.
Oh, okay, that would be fun. And I offer this really collaboratively and playfully, kind of with delight. The people who are most engaged in practice, they like talking about practice with each other. So that's kind of what we're doing. So, boy, so many things I could talk about. I'll tell you maybe two headlines that are real for me too, that have to do with what I've understood about the underlying causes and conditions in the body of peacefulness and freedom and, and love in the mind. Okay, what are some of those underlying causes and conditions that move us into practices we can do? One has to do with really taking seriously the Buddha's drive theory of suffering. So in that formulation that there is suffering. It's not all of life, but there is suffering. And the proximal cause of suffering is craving. There are other factors that cause people pain, including injustice, racism, invasions of countries cause a lot of suffering. Those are mediated by and affected by our own psychology and what the Buddha called craving, which is a drive state based on the sense that something is missing or wrong in the meeting of an important need. So what are the causes? So if craving is the cause of suffering, the causes of craving are an invasive sense of deficit or disturbance in the meeting of important needs. What are our major needs? A framework that's useful is safety, satisfaction, and connection, loosely associated with the three-stage, loosely, evolution of the brain: brainstem, subcortex, cortex, loosely, reptilian, mammalian, primate, especially human, lizard, mouse, monkey, safety, satisfaction, connection, loosely as a framework. Okay. Well, how can we help ourselves not crave so much? Two major takeaways. One takeaway is to grow psychological strengths that help you manage your needs without tipping into fleeing, fighting, or freezing, greed, hatred, or delusion as a way of responding to meeting your needs. For bursts, our animal ancestors and us learned to move into fight, flight, freeze, to get away from the charging lion. But as Robert Sapolsky puts it, most episodes of stress in the wild end quickly, one way or another, right? So we can manage brief bursts of red zone stress, but our biological template is to rest in what I call the green zone predominantly, in which there's an enoughness of safety, satisfaction, and connection in the moment so that we can default to our home base, our resting state, our sustainable biological and psychological equilibrium, which the body repairs and refuels itself, and in which the mind is characterized in terms of those three needs with a general sense of peacefulness, contentment, and love in the meeting of those needs, rather than, respectively, fear, frustration, and hurt or heartache. So, bottom line, as we build up psychological strengths to cope, to be resilient, to deal with the world around us and other people and our own minds, we're more able to meet challenges of life without feeling invasively flooded by them, to the point that we have a sense of something really important is missing or wrong in the meeting of a need. So that has really focused me a lot on relentlessly acquiring strengths by internalizing and installing experiences of these strengths to grow durable psychological resources hardwired into the nervous system, and to be an active agent in that process, rather than a passive recipient of various experiences in life with the hope that some of them stick. That has taken me into my focus on positive neuroplasticity, taking in the good, and deliberately helping states that are beneficial become beneficial traits, internalized as lasting changes of neural structure and function. That's a biggie, to look for what you could grow every day. Second, related to that, if you repeatedly internalize the felt sense of needs met enough in the moment, in this moment, I'm basically all right now, which disrupts the kind of well-intended delusional anxiety that we've evolved that keeps us always a little apprehensive and on our toes. But to realize, no, I can be vigilant, I can be strong, I can recognize threats, I can be intense if I need to be, while not feeling anxious or alarmed or traumatized in the core of my being. All right, I can rest there. So you could take that in. If also, for example, you have a sense of satisfaction met enough in the moment, there's enough food to eat, there's a accomplishing of goals, there could be a feeling of gratitude, you can have a sense of being content with what you have, even as you dream big dreams and dare greatly, as Brene Brown puts it, reach for the stars, including to help other people. That's an opportunity to take that in. And love, connection, when you feel connected, that too is an opportunity to internalize that. Well, as we repeatedly internalize the felt sense of needs met enough in the moment in various ways, it always has to be authentic, we gradually build up an underlying mood, a kind of that's somaticized. You just feel it in your body, in which the world is happening around you and you're dealing with it. There may be anxiety or anger or frustration or loss moving through the field of awareness, but underneath it all, in your core, there's resilient well-being that has a sense of enough about it that is not craving. That's a major practice, and it's a beautiful path. Everybody can walk it, a minute or 5 minutes a day, grow strengths inside, and internalize authentic experiences of peacefulness, contentment, and love to build up that mood inside. That was a big takeaway. to really appreciate that. And I'm stunned that more people in the Buddhist tradition don't actually look hard at craving and the sources of craving, which are primarily biological. Most practice that seeks to undermine craving does it through insight, which is particularly great if you can engage insight practices, 10 hours a day in your monastery. But if you are in the trenches of real life, it's really important to appreciate the actual embodied, visceral basis of craving as an animal that feels like its needs are not met in the moment. So you can really help yourself. That's a big headline. Maybe I'll pause for comment and then I'll
Yeah,
tell you another one. That'll be a lot shorter than that one. That
that
one took
was,
more time to explain.
that was well said. Yeah, and then I wonder for people to really practice this, you have this useful acronym HEAL,
Oh, I do,
HEAL,
yeah.
right? Maybe you could explain just so people know how they can practice this
Oh,
kind of thing.
well, that's kind of you. So we work backwards, right? Life is challenging. There is suffering. There are other people. What are we going to do? We need to grow the good inside of various kinds: positive mood, executive functions, skills, insight into our own mind, a whole bunch of stuff: gratitude, self worth, the healing of old pain, right? We need to grow the good inside. Well, how do you grow the lasting good inside that's actually hardwired into your body as a trait? Well, you can grow it kind of willy-nilly and passively in the flow of life, which is, we'll call it growth 1.0. And that's the model that has characterized the whole mental health field and the whole spiritual traditions broadly, in which people are regarded as passive vessels into which experiences and information are poured, with the hope that some of it sticks. The dirty little secret in clinical practice and mindfulness training as well, and other areas, is that it does stick for about a third to half the people. And that's enough to get statistical significance compared to, let's say, a control group of sorts. Great. But what about the third to half the people who don't report any lasting gain? They had a nice weekend. It was a great workshop. It was a wonderful therapy appointment. It was a beautiful conversation with a friend. And an hour later, a week later, they're the same, really. There's no trait gain. Right? How do you get trait gain? That has taken me into a growth 2.0 model. How can we respect people enough to regard them as active agents of their own healing, growing, and awakening, and their own learning? Very broadly stated, their own learning, by how they engage the experiences they're having at the time. What factors are they mobilizing internally in their relationship to experiences that they're trying to help to internalize? That has led me into a summary framework of those evidence-based factors. We published a paper about this just a few months ago. You might share it with your listeners through the Journal of Positive Psychology, Learning to Learn from Positive Experiences. That's Growth 2.0. Well, first, as a framework overall, how you can help yourself learn and grow a little every day. First, we start with having a beneficial experience, usually because it's already occurring. There you are in a lovely, non-dual way. It's happening, or we're having a good one, right? You and I, we're interacting. Wow, James Cooke, he's a real neuroscientist. He wants to talk with me. Great. It's happening already. Water tastes, I need water. It tastes good. Air to breathe. It's happening already. We can also create beneficial experiences deliberately by calling up compassion or mobilizing gratitude or reminding ourselves that we don't need to take ourselves so seriously. We don't need to believe every thought we have. We can help ourselves have a useful thought or feeling, sensation, desire, or action. Right? Now you're having that experience. You've got that song playing in your inner iPod. There's a beneficial state, mental neural pattern of activation that's occurring. Great. How do you turn on the inner recorder to maximize the registration, the lasting physiological change based on that experience? That then takes me in the second major phase of learning, activation, installation, experiencing, learning, into two aspects of installation: enriching and absorbing. E and A. Now we have a HEA in HEAL. Enriching has to do with helping experiences be big. You're not clinging to them. Actually, related to what I said earlier about craving, the more we internalize genuinely wholesome, beneficial experiences, the less hungry we are for them. Cultivation undoes craving over time. It's not sufficient for full enlightenment. There needs to be insight as well, and love. But it's a major factor there, right? So you can enrich experiences. I write about this a lot. Kind of the summary for me is stick with it for a breath or longer. Don't just click on to the next thing or let other people distract you to the next thing. You're not clinging to it. You're just staying with it. You're welcoming it. You're receiving it. You're helping it kind of last. If it starts to fade, you might kind of turn up the volume again. You come back to it and try to feel it in your body. The more embodied an experience is, even a sense of insight, the more you have a felt sense of that, you're going to build up somatic markers and register it more deeply. And there are other factors under the heading of enriching I get into, but those are two that are real good: duration and embodiment. Second, absorbing is increasing the sensitivity of the memory-making machinery broadly in your nervous system by intending to actually internalize this experience. Let it in, give over to it. A lot of people, they resist receiving beneficial experiences that they long for various reasons. Open to it and especially focus on what's rewarding about it, which increases activation, of dopamine and norepinephrine, including in the hippocampus, and has the sense of reward, the sense of enjoyment or meaningfulness in an important experience increases, so does dopamine and norepinephrine activity, and so does long-term consolidation of that experience in neural substrates. Any single time you use these methods will usually not be life-changing, but the gradual accumulation, a breath at a time, a minute at a time, of being more actively engaged in the internalization of wholesome experiences of what you want to grow in yourself. Bit by bit by bit, you'll be a little more different the day you do it than compared to not doing it that day. And then you accumulate that little more different, 10 days in a row, 100 days in a row, a year in a row, whoosh, you have really steepened your growth curve. That's have, enrich, and absorb. That's the essence, really, of, as it were, growing flowers in the garden of your mind. But what about the weeds? That takes us to the L for link. I did not invent any of these methods, by the way. I have invented the kind of comprehensive framework for them and the point of doing it, and I've embedded it in an evolutionary neurobiological framework. But these are familiar methods. We know how to do them. We just need to do them. All right. So linking involves being aware of both positive and negative at the same time. Keep the positive bigger. So my history, a lot of exclusion, a lot of loneliness, a lot of feelings of inadequacy as a young, dorky kid going through school whose parents were loving but not good at empathy. So I felt unseen and unwanted and unvalued a lot. Okay, that's negative material. Matched positive material could be something like, oh, James Cooke, leading neuroscientist, has a great podcast. He's interested. It's sincere. It's genuine. It's not conceited. It's actual. Oh, we're very social. Human experience of feeling included, seen, appreciated, in rapport, friendliness. If I were in Portugal, you'd be definitely a kind of person. I'd say, hey, man, let's go for a walk or do something cool. All right. I could have a large experience of that while off to the side, there's little Ricky, picked last for sports teams because he was small and nobody really wanted him when he was a little kid. Being aware of both of those at the same time, neurons that fire together, wire together broadly, they start to associate. And we can then start to associate to that negative material, that big positive material. This method is used routinely in therapy. Mindfulness, spacious awareness is a kind of linking. Compassion's a kind of linking as well, because there's the spaciousness of awareness with the pain in it, or there's the benevolence, the tender concern of compassion with the pain, right? That's linking of sorts. And we can use this method both on the fly. If you start having a strong positive experience that for you is a kind of important psychological nutrient, your vitamin C. You can deliberately, if you want to, bring it into contact with that negative material bit by bit, as long as you don't get hijacked by the negative, which I've done that thousands of times, usually 5 seconds or 10 seconds at a time. Or if you are in touch with negative material, feel it. You know, I have a little saying, deal with the bad, turn to the good, take in the good, right? Deal with the bad, feel it, it flows. At a certain point, there's a sense of releasing it. And then there's a certain point where you feel like, okay, what do I want to replace what I've released with? And then at that point, you can start to engage linking in a way that can clear away some of that negative. And in fact, again, something I'm sure you know, if you stay with the positive for, and you come back to it, you remind yourself of it a handful of times during the hour or so after the negative's been activated, and now it's being reconsolidated physically, literally. During that window of reconsolidation, you can disrupt the reconsolidation of the negative by deliberately being aware of something beneficial or minimally neutral related to whatever the stimulus was, the situation, the person, the event that the negative was associated with. That will disrupt literally and erase the negative material gradually over time. So that's a quick summary of the HEAL framework, self-directed neuroplasticity in a nutshell.
That's great, thank you. I hope I haven't taken us too far away from your second point about the brain and meditation, if you can remember.
Oh, you want to go there? Oh, okay, great. Right. Watch out, you ask me a question, I might.
Yeah.
Well, here's the second thing that I've gotten a lot at, and that's been much more recent. So the bit about the importance of learning to install strengths so you don't crave so much. And second, internalizing the felt sense of the needs met enough in the moment. That's been there for a while. Just recently, really, I've become more and more aware of research that shows that, to summarize, a lot of our suffering involves activation of the midline strip of the cortex, whether it's task-relevant, goal-directed portions that are more frontal, spreading slightly to the side, or default mode network, also midline, but also spreading more to the side. That midline activation is very involved with mental time travel, future and past, and it's very involved with the construction of a sense of self, a beleaguered, contracted, separated, vulnerable, inadequate, sense of self that needs to be continually shored up, protected, defended, and ornamented in various ways, right? So operationally, you want to suffer less? You want to be happier? Clock more time in with less midline activation, midline dominant activation, which looks somewhat like more lateral network activation or more global activation. Lateral, right-sided for right-handed people, because that's the part of the brain, does more spatial or gestalt, whole processing. So a lot, structurally, of suffering less and awakening more is disengaging from parts and opening into the whole, disengaging from figures and opening into the ground. Now here, again, this is what the great non-dual teachers have been saying forever, right? But we can neurologize it, and based on the neurologizing, be more motivated to engage it and start playing around with hacking, in effect, our brain with simple things we can do that are not so conceptual as an insight into the ultimate oneness of reality. Great, but do you feel it? Especially because you have a body that's designed not to feel that, and in fact designed to feel the opposite of everything's partitioned and decomposed into parts, and you're supposed to grasp at everything even as it changes beneath your feet. So how do you actually rest in a sense of the whole? Well, there are things that can help you do that. And I've just really gotten a lot of mileage from doing them. One is to have a sense of your chest and then your body as a whole as you breathe, rather than targeting one particular area of sensation. Take your whole body as the field, as a single field in which many sensations are occurring. Kaboom. That takes you out into the whole. Another trick is to have a sense of the whole volume of the room you're in, or to raise your gaze to the horizon. And as James Austin has pointed out, visually, we tend to be very egocentric in our frame of visual processing when our gaze is close to us, because as our ancestors evolved, including hominid and human ancestors, friends or foes were close. That's where we needed to be very self-referential. But when we move our gaze out to the horizon line, naturally, that sense of egocentric, self-referential processing starts quieting, and a more what Austin called allocentric form of perceptual processing that's impersonal and takes the whole into account and doesn't privilege our own perspective, starts engaging as you just move your gaze out. That's partly why there are practices that do this. Sky gazing, a lot of first people practices. Being in nature tends to draw us out into a sense of things as a whole. Asking people to take a bird's eye view, a big picture perspective, takes people out into a whole. Sensing your mind as a whole, as a whole field of experience in which, yes, there's many patterns that are occurring, but it's one whole field, awareness included. It's not dualistically even divided between awareness and its objects. You just take mind as a whole, kaboosh. You'll notice instantly, within seconds, you're suffering less, there's less contraction, you're calmer, you're clearer, you're seeing the big picture. So that's definitely been a big practice. And then I guess the last one is to highlight and come back to again and again love. Because if you think of it, love is the universal medicine. In other words, love contains both that sense of needs met enough in the moment, because love ticks all three boxes. Love obviously meets our needs for connection. It's rewarding. Love feels good, whether it's flowing out or flowing in. And love is a primal signal of safety in our hunter-gatherer background. So resting in the heart is a very powerful way to get that value that I talked about in terms of growing psychological resources and feeling like needs are met enough in the moment, so you're rested in the green zone and with little craving. And love takes us out into the whole and relaxes and tends to dissolve the sense of the self-contraction.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it.
I think the that last point, it really points to one of the most important things I went through in my kind of healing journey, which is discovering for myself the existence of the kind of love that you were describing in terms of wholeness, the kind of love that looked at from certain angles, it's almost the same thing as just a kind of awareness that just accepts everything that arises, but it's an aspect almost, I would say, of awareness where it's not, I love that in a relativistic way. It's this kind of all-encompassing, welcoming. Discovering that was really, a huge moment, and kind of became the path for me in terms of healing things, was learning to surrender into that. And I completely agree with you. You said it has so many different facets that it taps into. And there was the chapter on wholeness was one of my favorite chapters of your book, Neurodharma. I also loved the one on nowness, which there's a great discussion of a kind of aside about physicists talking about the nature of time, and in an expanding universe that's four-dimensional, time being a dimension, we can think of time, our existing in the now as being at the kind of leading edge of the unfolding of existence, which I really feel. And you had a really interesting exploration of the way that we can use our orienting ventral or lower attention networks to tap into this. Maybe you could share that with people as well.
Oh, I'd be happy to. And you touched my heart there a moment ago, when you talked about love and dropping into love as the field. And people who, and I want to repeat a point I made earlier, the path that I've personally taken, in part being informed by what's happening in the body as the basis for what's happening in the mind, is not a necessary path. Because clearly you and other people, me included, have been able to, drop into ways of being or stabilize ways of being without knowing a darn thing about the hardware. So that said, I want to really, acknowledge that disclaimer. Well, gosh, I'm glad you read the book, and you paid attention to it. So all the great teachers say, right, be here now. Yeah, great. How do you do that for more than a blink or a second or two or three, right? And as you know from the book and also your own background, there is a kind of processing stream, and knowing this is actually helpful. And people can observe that, especially if they're a little quiet, like they're meditating a little bit, you can start to recognize the emerging nature of experience. And we can know from a third person perspective that our perceptions of the world, our formed perception, are probably about a 20th of a second delayed, or a 10th even. But reality is happening always a little bit before typically our normal consciousness, at least, registration of it, which is an interesting detail. But at the point that there is the emergence of a conscious percept, a sound, an event, it starts with the fact that something has changed. You're being alerted to it. There's that initial alerting response. And you can also think of an ancestor 20 million years ago, back in Africa, a primate, let's say, moving through the wild and trying to avoid predators. And there's been, like a sound. Something has happened. We don't know what it is, but instantly there's an alerting function. That alerting function is non-conceptual. It's not personal. You can observe it in your own mind. It feels very impersonal. And then on the heels of that alerting step is an orienting function, where we start to locate where is it. And then on the heels of that, we begin to identify what it is. And then on the heels of that, we start mobilizing a response based on the relevance. Is that sound just the wind in the trees, or is it the sound of a predator rustling the leaves as they move toward you? Where the suffering is in the constructing of the mind, this goes to the Buddhist model of the aggregates, right, which you're familiar with. And so I'll do it for people in general, there are these ways that kind of deconstruct the stream of consciousness into these 5 aspects. The first is called form. Essentially, it's bare apprehension, bare sensory information. Then there is the sense of the hedonic tone of that, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. I would add, I think, an emerging 4th hedonic tone of relationality. But see what you think about that. And also what's perception, categorizing, memory. What is it? So we got 3 so far: form, feeling tone, or hedonic tone, and perception. Then what are called the mental formations, everything else: thoughts, feelings, memories, your Myers-Briggs profile, your Enneagram point, all this, your trauma history, whatever, all that stuff muttering away in a field of awareness, and awareness being constructed moment to moment to moment in a condition, in a dependent kind of way, not as a cosmic consciousness. All right, that's kind of the Buddhist model of consciousness. Well, if you look at it, where does suffering happen? Suffering and the selfing that's very involved in suffering happens in the mental formations, the 4th of those. The closer we can move in the processing stream of the immediacy of lived experience to perception, raw hedonic tone, and especially form, suffering fades, suffering falls away. We're moving so close to the emergent edge of now. And if we can stay there, suffering has not had time. and selfing has not had time to get its hooks in. So, as a practice, and again, as I talk, you and other listeners might immediately register, oh, my guru told me that, or I read that in some Tibetan manual, or oh, Ram Dass was all over that. Great, it's all true. I'm not inventing it, but we're now understanding why, as we become more and more able to rest in the immediacy of the arising moment, very much a Zen practice of just sitting, just being, before conceptualizing, before categorizing, before even kind of knowing what it is. We're just in the immediacy of there is, it is happening. It's not that I am having an experience, it's that experiences are occurring on the tail end of which they are forming an I, right? The experiences are having an I, in effect. It's almost ecstatic. Like Eckhart Tolle is right, it's power, it's ecstasy. And the only way you can sustain that is to be continually releasing. Now that continual release of the arising moment can be alarming. There's stages of contemplative practice in the Theravada tradition through the stages of insight where you become so aware of impermanence that it's very, very scary. And people can quit. It's really helpful to appreciate the endless arisingness of experience, even as it passes through you. Then you become more comfortable with groundlessness and letting it go continuously. So that practice of paying attention to the alerting function in your own brain, and also being aware of the ways in which the alerting function is associated with this allocentric oneness perspective that James Austin has talked about. And the alerting function is very involved when you have a sense of the wholeness of your own psyche. Because there are no parts. It's whole continuously as it arises. The three of those go together, and they go together neurologically in some interesting ways in terms of lower streams of processing and activation in your brain, more kind of early in terms of evolution, and typically right-sided for right-handed people, switched for many left-handed people. So this sense of basically wholeness, nowness, and allness tend to go together, and they reinforce each other, and you can engage that in your own practice.
Yeah, that's great. And when people do these practices, they can often connect with, you mentioned terms earlier, like the kind of the ground of being, or the unborn, I guess. This sense that there's something that might be described as transcendental at the kind of root of the universe. And in Neurodharma, where you write about this, I found it really interesting because I have a very strong naturalistic bias. But at the same time, to read your descriptions of what you were describing as transcendent, it's things that I think kind of do exist, really. I mean, I guess my picture would be that reality itself is beyond the models we make of it. It's unspeakable what it is. It's awe-inspiring. My mouth, the words stop when I try to describe it because it's so wow. And so then if someone wants to use a word like God or transcendent or something, I understand why they would do that. But to me, I still think when you see reality that way, and then you think science kind of just offers a map and overlay of that universe, to me, I think of it still as kind of naturalistic. But I'm interested because in your work, you present a very kind of naturalistic, way people can apply these methods. They don't have to believe anything. But then you also kind of discuss, this interesting different traditions, different people differ on whether they find this transcendental kind of conception useful. So I'm just interested to invite you to share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, this territory can be some of the most controversial and engages people, and how I come to it and in myself as a person too is to be open to a strictly atheistic, scientifically materialistic view. The universe, the Big Bang universe, is all there is. Sure, there might be other Big Bang universes. No higher power was involved in that, or even if there might be, it's not relevant to practice. That's kind of that view. And I'm like, okay, Then there's the view of others, and arguably the view of the Buddha, expressed somewhat obliquely and obscurely in terms of that which is unconditioned. If the Big Bang universe unfolds in a conditioned way, and all of its phenomena are conditioned, including, we could argue, the conditioning of quantum uncertainty, even if that's a thing. But minimally, when you start moving up to objects the size of molecules or atoms, and definitely the size of grains of sand, it's a clockwork falling of the dominoes of conditionality. The Buddha said, well, it is possible to touch into or tap into that which is radically unconditioned. Now, dogmatic, I would say strict atheists would say, yeah, it's that which you tap into is a brain state, is a mind-brain state that seems unconditioned. In other words, it seems like a field that is timeless and is the ground, but that's just an extraordinary experience and state of being that is transformative and enlightening and wonderful and desirable, but still within the dominoes falling clockwork on deterministic unfolding of the conditioned Big Bang universe. Okay. Maybe not, though. And if maybe not, what might that be? So then we have those who speak of his saints and sages throughout history. Arguably the Buddha, in his own somewhat obscure way, talks about unconditionality, that which could be unconditioned. And my orientation to that, and I have a sense of it, is experientially, it's like, what's always just prior to now? And it seems to me logically possible that there, and maybe it's with string theory, it's, other dimensions in which the four-dimensional Big Bang universe is unfolding. I don't know. So in reference to that is timeless because it's not changing in time compared to our time unfolding, whatever. But minimally, it seems like there's kind of a ground of possibility, unconditioned. It's always not yet conditioned. And in our own practice, for me, it's been really helpful to at least imagine, maybe it's not true, but it sure feels like skillful means, to have a felt recognizing of what feels like a timelessness in which time is proceeding, or an unconditionality in which phenomena are occurring. And to feel a little bit like, it's kind of visceral for me, it feels like the back is just rested in the unconditioned, while in the front is moving into form, which is then continually changing. And to feel stably rested in timelessness while time unfolds, it seems like a good characterization of a lot of the teachings of the great ones, in our time today or who've passed before us. And then there's also a sense of whether that unconditionality, timelessness, the absolute, is language people use, not in a Abrahamic, monotheistic, God kind of sense, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, although, don't know. I'm not, don't know. I'm not going to be disrespectful about that. Don't know. But there's the key question. In addition to unconditionality, which seems like the minimal necessary attribute of the transcendental, if there is a transcendental or transcendental matter, is the question of whether consciousness and also benevolence are attributes of transcendentality, because as soon as you say the transcendental, it sounds like you make it a noun into a thing, right? And I think that there's I'll be straight. I do have in my practice is very much engaging the natural to become open to the transcendental, and to become more permeable and available and so forth, and with a remembrance, a felt remembrance of it. And as an aspect of that, it sure does seem that awareness, some kind of consciousness. I have a notion that Heisenberg was right, that consciousness is necessary, in effect, the implications are correct, for quantum potentiality to congeal into actuality at the emerging edge of now, which is a mouthful. But if you imagine that consciousness of some sort must be woven into the substrate of physical reality for quantum potentiality to become actual everywhere, continuously in the Big Bang universe, well, that's a scientifically semi-credible way of thinking about a kind of impersonal, transpersonal consciousness woven into the fabric of reality that at bottom our own personal awareness consciousness has access to and is infused by. That consciousness is woven into the fabric of grains of sand, bowling balls, asteroids, I don't know, washing machines, right? It's not, by definition, it's immanent, it's everywhere. It's not just, human consciousness, but human consciousness at bottom can feel like a portal into that transpersonal, non-local consciousness. And then love. Is there love? Is there a benevolence? And then how do you deal with the problem of theodicy? How could a benevolent force allow the Holocaust or, child abuse? But maybe if we don't think of it as an omnipotent, omniscient entity who's deciding whether this kid gets molested and that kid doesn't, how do you square that with a benevolent divine? That's a major problem. But if you just think of the transcendental in the way I'm speaking of, which is a more Vedanta kind of style, non-dual way of talking about it, well, part of the love is in the endless emergence of the next moment. That's just the endless givingness of the arising is loving in some broad sense. It's a lovingness, kind of like your notion of love is a field that includes child abuse, war crimes, traffic jams, cancer, striking people down way too young, all the rest of it. But none of that takes away from what the nature of the field as having these, I'll finish, qualities perhaps of possibility, consciousness, awareness, and benevolence.
Right. Yeah, very well said. If we start with the experience, I share this experience. When I look inward, I find at the core of my nature is, even deeper than consciousness, is a kind of potent void, like a kind of a no thing.
Beautiful.
But yeah. It's full. It's all of this. It's an unfolding, and I feel I know that. I recognize that and I see it, and it feels like it exists more than anything. And then when I chase that down, I think, well, what could this? If I'm recognizing something about myself as part of the universe, and through looking inwards, I'm actually discovering something about the universe. A lot of people, when they do this, they think, okay, well, my true nature is consciousness. Maybe the universe is consciousness. That's not how I tend to think about it. I think, as I say, deeper than whether or not the lights are on or not in this particular part of the universe, there's this potent kind of, as you kind of said with the quantum unfolding, that there's this potentiality collapsing into actuality. There's this wellspring of existence. And when for most people, I think they say, there's a mystery to it, and it's kind of, you can't really understand it. But I do find that my mind comes up with what I find to be quite a nice little kind of logical story that naturalizes this, where you could say, if you ask why there's something rather than nothing, if you say, well, maybe nothing's the default, because you have to justify where there's something. So if there's not something, then there's nothing. Well, what is the nature of nothing? Presumably there can be no boundaries, there can be no limits. It's completely unconstrained, unbounded. So it's a kind of infinite, potent nothingness. And so I can imagine that's what it feels like when I look inside. That's what I find. And if that is the kind of the prerequisite for our existence, is almost kind of a logical this little puzzle where basically it's like, well, if something exists, great, something exists, and we get what we've got now. But if nothing exists, then there's potent, unbound creativity potential. And at some point, if you want to use time analogy, things will start happening as kind of the universe goes through all the permutations of what is possible. So to me, that's my conception of reality, really, is that there is this potent ground of being, this void, this unnameable, unconceptualizable thing. But I also think it's naturalistic. I think that's what we find ourselves in, this unfolding process. And then I agree. I also find this benevolence when I look inside, and the story I'm inclined to tell is one of, well, as living organisms that have in order to exist, we have to have a bias in the direction of flourishing. Any organism that has a bias towards pain self-destructs very quickly, runs towards the pain, dies. So I feel like when we look inside, because we are kind of limited by being in our own minds, we recognize consciousness, we recognize this very wholesome desire for flourishing, this true, I really suspect this is in deep down in everyone, that like even the most people who cause most harm in the world, I think there's at their core, there's probably this sense of, I really want things to go well, and people really don't understand why I'm causing. If they knew my story, they would see that I'm actually a good person, even though I killed people and I do this other stuff. I'm just misunderstood. I think that's actually really at the core of all humans. But I think it's this. So I think there is this preference for flourishing if it's possible, or where it's possible. So I think sometimes we can project what's going on in our own minds onto the universe, and maybe that's what I'm doing with this potent void thing. But again, I'm aware that, you know, through being raised Catholic and all this stuff, I have a bias against the kind of supernatural and things that makes me. I come with my own particular biases. So I'm telling a story that tries to strip away any speculation that might not fit in with a naturalistic worldview. So that's, I guess, a caveat to offer with that story.
Well, if there's some confirmation of so many great, seemingly remarkable people, that's one thing that for me, I look at as increasing the credibility of what we're pointing to, that so many people around the world throughout history from so many different cultures in so many different ways have been pointing more or less at the same thing. Right. And your account of a fertile void, Lao Tzu was talking about that. It's right there in Vedanta. I mean, it's just, my friend and teacher, Stephen Snyder, who is a wonderful person for people to learn about, a Zen teacher, deeply trained in Theravadan concentration practices, the jhanas and beyond the jhanas, and then nirvana, and also a super bright retired lawyer kind of person. He uses the word absence, which is an interesting way to talk about that fertile void as a kind of absence. It's present. It's an aspect of the absolute, but it's just not yet manifest. It's a field of possibility, in which so much can happen, and it pervades everything. You and I know we'll wrap up soon, unfortunately, but you and I, we can feel that quality in both of us, right? Yeah.
That is a great place to wrap up, actually. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's good. We can feel that, and I just feel super blessed and fortunate that we live in a time where here we are 10,000 miles away from each other. We can talk, and yes, there are difficult things in the world, and still we have access to so many teachings, so many paths of wisdom. And also just at a personal level, what a beautiful thing that we can hang out and
absolutely
feel this and talk about it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your work. I really appreciate what you're doing.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad that somebody appreciates Neurodharma. I think it's chock full of good stuff and it was well considered and it's very practical, and there's a very practice oriented aspect to it. And truly, may our efforts here, and I'm sure you feel the same way, may our efforts here be helpful to people and known and unknown, seen and unseen forever.
Right. Yeah, I think trying to be of service is the ultimate thing you can do with your life, and I recognize that in you and I appreciate it. Where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more online?
Oh, thanks. rickhanson.net, SON. With our son, we have a podcast also, the Being Well podcast. It's typically very kind of practical, therapeutic, and, sort of everyday self-help. And it's a very good podcast, and sometimes we have guests on it too. So just my name, Rick Hanson, SON.net. That's a good place to start.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you again.
James. Yeah, you too.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cooke.